All right, everybody, how's it going? Am I out of focus? Hold on, bring it back. There we go. Good evening, everybody. Now, I haven't been able to get the stream on slow mode for some reason. I can't seem to find the function. So, do I try to go get into slow mode or do we just leave it the way it is? Let me try it for 30 more seconds while you see me futz away at my computer. I'm going to go to video details. I always am able to. This doesn't make sense. I cannot find out how to put it on slow mode today. I've only been doing this for however long. Okay, I can't do it. I'm going to close that down. So long as it doesn't bother everybody, I guess we're not going to go slow mode tonight. No, the mods don't have. Let me see here. Mods Adam Ingram says the mods are asleep. No, it's. I set it up beforehand, and I don't understand why I don't see the very same function in order to. Do I? Okay, so let me just see. Do I try to do it? Someone just asked, Viva, do you shave the spot under your lip? Let me see if I can find that one. Oh, okay. Sorry, you know what? I can't find that comment. This might be very difficult. Why on earth can I not? Freedom. Okay, we're going to live with it. Sorry, guys. I might take a few seconds when Robert is talking to go and try to figure out how to put it on slow mode, but looks okay. Okay, so tonight, I mean, there's only one thing that we can possibly talk about. Yeah, it's the thing that has been obsessing everybody for the last 4 years. Okay. The elections. What on earth is going on? We did a live stream last Wednesday. Wednesday or Thursday. It was after the elections to talk about where things stood. And tonight we're going to go into a little more detail as to where things are likely going to go and what's going to happen over the next month to 2 months, because it's fascinating. Etienne Lilly says, my first time actually watching you live. Thanks for all you do. Your analyses are enlightening and important. Thank you very much. The super fast, not super, the comment section is going to be very difficult. Christopher Henley says, I bet elections officials can't slow mo it either. So this is what's going on. First of all, let's start with the standard opening. Super chats, thank you very much in advance. I'm going to miss some of them. And if you're going to be upset if I miss it, don't do the super chat. It's going to make me feel guilty thinking that someone's going to think that I took the super chat and ignored them and that I'm a grifter or whatever they call. Don't do it if you're going to feel bad if I don't get to it, but I thank you in advance for the support. So you should know, YouTube takes 30% of super chats if anybody has any moral qualms feeding the beast as opposed to feeding the algorithm. Okay, so there's that. Lucas Farber says, so sad as a U.S. citizen, I have to watch Sky News Australia for honest election coverage from legacy media. Yeah, this is, it's an amazing thing. You know, like the battle, some opening thoughts, the battle between standard media and what the standard media tries to call fringe media is an amazing thing. I'm old enough. I remember once upon a time, journalists and journalism used to be what Project Veritas is doing today. Today, you have this CNNs and the MSNBCs, and I'm not going to name names, who are acting like they are the arbiters of truth and what they say is true as opposed to them actually going to discover what is true. And then they try to write off anybody who is doing actual investigative journalism, even if they get it wrong, and even if they're promoting conspiracy theories, in quotes, as conspiracy theorist nuts, and they try to discredit them as far-right nonsense news. And it's a battle for truth, and it's a battle for the minds of the people. It's not a battle for the truth. It's a battle for the minds of the people to write off those who are seemingly doing the only investigative journalism these days. So it's crazy. You missed my 1 million. Bambunga, nice to see you again. Okay, that's the one opening thought. It's crazy. You know, the thing about maybe Project Veritas are out in left field and they're promoting untenable stories. Well, you know what undermines that? Responding to that and letting them get their stories out there without undermining them at their core. I'm on AOC's hit list under the name, not saying it. In French, we would say Jacques Milf. Oh, I just did it. Now I'm in trouble. And I like that avatar. It's it's something else when you have the media, which this is not a partisan observation. The media is anti-Trump, and they've been anti-Trump for 4, 5, 6 years. Maybe they're right to be anti-Trump. Maybe they're wrong. It's not a controversial thing to say they are anti-Trump. They have been anti-Trump from day one. Whether they're right or wrong, that's the fact. That's the fact. They have been pro-Biden. That's a fact. I mean, maybe you think they're right. Maybe you think Biden is objectively right and deserves it, and Trump is objectively wrong and deserves it. They have that coupled with big tech censorship, which has been by and large anti-Trump. You have the media now telling you everything's fine, look the other way. And I was thinking today, next year, all that it takes is for the media to not report on every potential hurricane, to not give them letters A through Z, so that it feels like there are fewer next year than there are this year. And lo and behold, I mean, you can craft the narrative based on the reporting, and you can shape reality based on the reporting and not based on investigating reality. It's crazy. And then the one other thing I wanted to say, just as an opening thought, poll workers won. So we need 150,000 votes for Biden. Poll 2, yeah, poll 1. All right, P2. Oh, make sure to add about 30 Trump votes in every part 100. I wish you told me earlier. Gotta love government competence. I don't know if that's true, and I don't know if that happened, but I mean, the videos are circulating. The one thing I was going to say, passions are flaring. I think, at least as it stands now, having observed both 2016 and 2020, I think some people are dealing with the prospect of defeat better than other people dealt with the prospect of defeat back then. I'm not so sure that people are dealing with the prospect of victory any better than people were dealing with the prospect of victory back in 2016. I remember the memes, the timeline of that person screaming on the street and crying. I think people were very not vengeful. They were gloating in victory, as is to be expected in politics and sports. But I think as it stands now, people are generally reacting better to the defeat. But I know people are impassioned, and I know people are angry, and I know people are frustrated. First trick in life is don't let your emotions get the better of you in terms of what you say and what you do, ever. Full stop. And with that said, keep it civil in the discussion. Keep it civil in the manner in which you express yourselves. There is no benefit to expressing yourself in a manner that can be misinterpreted badly. And keep a hold of your emotions, because it will affect the way you reason if you let your emotions get the better of you. Now, with that said, I see Robert is looking dapper, and he's smiling. This is good. I have been under stress seeing the world under stress, but Barnes has got a smile on his face, so he's looking good. Robert, how you doing?
Good.
Okay, where do we start tonight? First of all, let's start with general stuff. Any news on any of the current suits that you're involved in that we can discuss? I'm thinking Amy Cooper in particular. Any developments?
No developments as yet in any of those. Trying to think. Yeah, no, not really. So in none of those cases, there might be other cases coming, but no, none of the current ones.
Okay, and now the other one, which was the We Build the Wall Colfage Bannon. There was a development in that where apparently the prosecuting attorneys had made a motion to pay themselves from the fund for We Build the Wall. Do you know anything about that?
It goes to the issue about the attempt to freeze funds. I had recommended, I think I said so publicly on here, that this is a major problem. They use the excuse of freezing funds as a sort of a forfeiture remedy before any jury has made a determination. And in a decision that was a bad decision by Scalia, he approved, along with other Supreme Court justices, a large degree of these restraints of your property, forfeiture of your property, without a jury trial. And not only that, forfeiting your property in such a way that you can't have the counsel of your choice to defend you in that jury trial. And so they slightly, they made occasional adjustments over the years, which they're supposed to allow for at least some funds to be used for choice of counsel. But you basically have to make a motion for it. The big problem I have is that they seized far more money than even they allege was fraudulently taken. So they had no right to that money, period. So my argument from the get-go was that all of the excess money beyond what they claim were the results of criminal proceeds should be returned to those who run the fund. But at a minimum, those excess funds should be used or be made available so they can have the counsel of their choice. And that's what that issue is likely about. I haven't seen the actual motion, but it's what I had recommended. I also, if I were representing any of those people, or what I've publicly recommended, is there should be a motion to transfer venue. It has no business in the Southern District of New York, no nexus to the Southern District of New York. It doesn't belong in the Southern District of New York. The witnesses will not be in the Southern District of New York. So it should be transferred out. And it's like the Roger Stone case. You have to early on make clear to the court and to the world that you understand the railroading that is attempted or being attempted or is going to be attempted, and expose it at a minimum and make them at least deal with it directly. Otherwise, you're by the time you figure out what's happening, you will in fact be railroaded.
And because I had sent you the article was sent to me, and it was apparently the prosecutor. They were trying to get paid from the fund. The motion was denied, and I couldn't get a copy of the motion to see if it was on the basis of.
Do you mean the defense attorney was requesting the funds?
No. My understanding was the prosecution. From what I understood, the prosecution wanted to get paid from the funds,
that wouldn't make sense. So it may be the prosecution wanted the permission to release some of the funds for the defense to procure counsel, but no funds would ever be used to pay the prosecutor.
Okay, well then I'm going to have to double check. If anybody knows what,
I haven't read the motion, so I don't know.
No, that's the thing, and I couldn't get a copy of the motion. I read an article, and but from what I understood from the article, the motion was refused, which was the good part. So, okay, so now I figured as a good intro to this week's discussion on what's going on, we start with Bush versus Gore. In the year 2000, I was reading up on it again today and watching some videos. It's amazing how history tends to repeat itself, and I don't know who remembers that as much as they should, given what's going on today. But I mean, the Bush v. Gore, it's similar, except instead of it being 5 or 6 battleground states, it all came down to Florida, in that both Al Gore and George Bush, the son, they were at 260 and change and 240 and change, and whoever got Florida would win the election. The night of the election, it was too close to call. I think at some point Al Gore might have conceded to Bush and then retracted his concession. And then they started counting, and they started recounting, and they went to the state courts of Florida, who ordered recounts of certain counties, and some counties couldn't recount within the deadline that was provided in the court, and their counts weren't counted. And then it went to the Supreme Court, who then stopped the recount on the basis of I forget which amendments, but it was unequal application of the law, and they were saying they weren't counting some votes as equal to other votes. They stopped the recount, and Bush ended up winning by however many hundreds, and they declared the election 37 days later. More or less accurate?
Yes, and it's the reason why I have a book of someone I've actually been critical of, but it's still a good book. It's the biography of David Boies, called Versus Goliath, or V Goliath. And now he's an extraordinarily skilled lawyer. He just has a magical ability to show up in ways that favor the political establishment in a lot of cases. And so that's where I've always said, track David Boies and you'll learn what's happening with a case. Not because of his skill set, but because of his connections and acumen. But there's the last chapter, the last portion of the book, multiple chapters, is about, he represented Al Gore in that dispute. And it's his recollection of what took place. And so it's very interesting about it gets into it. There's also I think an HBO documentary on it. Now, the HBO documentary favors it from the Democratic side, of course. Essentially, I mean, you'll notice the radical difference between how both the political establishment and the press treated Bush v. Gore versus this one. I mean, we just had an election a few days ago. In Bush v. Gore, that went on until mid-December. And not only that, it really went on through early January, because we'll get into what the constitutional process to resolve and certify elections, that the system has gone to great lengths to avoid our constitutional system being enforced when it comes to the way we elect the most powerful office holder in the world. Because what happened was there was ultimately a bunch of Democratic House members who wanted to challenge the results from Florida, and they could not get a single Democratic senator to join them, and that is why there was never a discussion in Congress about the certification of those electors. My view was back then, and I was public about it. I was a recent law graduate. I graduated a few months before. But my view was that we needed to start using our constitutional precedent, and that included going to Congress to have contested issues of an election decided. An objection should have been raised. There should have been hearings and presentation of their information. It's still expedited and compacted, but a reasonable time afforded for that, and a vote held. Now, there was no chance Gore had of winning, because the majority of state delegations were held by Republicans, is my recollection, in 2000. But my view is it still should have gone forward in that direction, because that's what the Constitution called for. And this fear of using it, we haven't used it really since 1876, I've never understood, because our forefathers, our founders, understood that the best way to resolve contested issues about an election was to allow the elected members of the House of Representatives by state delegation be the ones to decide any contested issue. And because that way it's the check, it's a little d democratic check. It's whoever was elected this time. It's not the prior Congress, but the newly elected Congress, because the Congress gets sworn in first, and then you have the presidential certification vote. And that's how the process should work, and I can extend it more. But but that's where it should have ended, and it partially ended there, but only because a senator refused to join. And it tells you how the establishment operates. They are more concerned, more driven, more motivated by maintaining the illusion of integrity than its actuality. And I think that's always been a mistake. When W got elected, about a third to almost half, depending on the poll you read, of the country believed he was illegitimate. And the only reason that disappeared from the public narrative was because about 8 months later, 9/11 happened. If 9/11 hadn't have happened, those issues would have continued to accumulate. And there were some people who had skepticism about 9/11 related to that fact. But that's what if we both sides should desire that we exercise the constitutional process to enhance the number of people who believe in the outcome of this election. Regardless of if you have no doubts that this election put Joe Biden in office, then that's even more reason to have it go through the constitutionally ordained process.
Can you? And actually, we discussed it Thursday, but just in case anybody doesn't fully appreciate this, and this was a discussion I was having with someone just today, where they said they called it. I said, well, the media doesn't do anything. The media. Actually, it was to a younger person. I was trying to say projection. The media projects Biden's going to be the winner. That's not any formal declaration. Most people don't fully appreciate this. They appreciate what the projection means, but they don't appreciate what the next steps of the process is. So setting aside media calls it, media doesn't call it. Media says we're going to wait 3 weeks, forget what happens in court. What is the ordinary process that happens afterwards in order to get those electoral college votes from the general elections of the states and then grant them to the person who becomes the next president?
So what the Constitution provides for is it gives state legislatures. First, we elect presidents by states because we're the United States of America. We don't elect. There's no popular vote. There's no such thing. There's only the states that make choices, and they delegate that explicitly and expressly and by limitation to the legislatures of the states. The governors are given no power. The executive branch is given no power, except for that power given to them by the state legislatures. So the state legislatures decide who the electors are going to be and how those electors are going to be decided. So that's step one. So the state legislatures then decide that methodology. They can decide to choose the electors themselves. This was part of the point in Bush v. Gore, that the Constitution did not give that right directly to the public. It gave that right to the state legislatures, and it was up to the state legislatures whether to give that to the public in terms of a vote. The state legislatures then choose the method by which an elector will be chosen. And so then it depends on the state laws. Did the state legislature set a time and date for the election? Did they give that power to the voters? The other point of Bush v. Gore was that once they give that power to the voters, they must apply the 14th Amendment's equal protection clause and not value some votes more than other votes or have disparate or different or discriminatory standards in how they make that determination. That once you say the people of the state the qualified voters of the people of the state will get to pick the next president by whoever wins the most votes in our state, that person, then you cannot discriminate in how you allocate that vote or count that vote. And so there are constitutional constraints at how the state legislatures exercise their power of picking electors, but they are the ones given the exclusive discretion about how that works.
And the time frame in which they do that, the state legislatures do that after the new, I don't want to use the wrong word, after the new members have been elected in the same election?
Well, really, they do that before the election happens at all. So the state legislatures determine how are we going to elect electors for the presidency. And in the United States, all the states have said we're going to allow the people of the state to pick, and it varies. For example, I mean for non-presidential elections in Maine, you have ranked choice voting. So for the Senate or for Congress, you get to pick 1, 2, 3, or 4. And if you're third, if whoever finishes third or fourth, then your vote goes to the next one. So let's say you voted for the Democrat. Let's say you voted for the Libertarian number 1 and the Green Party number 2 and the Independent number 3 and then the Democrat number 4. It's only when the first 3 don't make the top 2 that your fourth vote then counts for the Democrat. But in the presidential elections right now, and you have for example, that's why you have some states that have delegated it by congressional district. So in Maine and Nebraska, they say we're going to elect our electors by whatever the voters within each congressional district choose. That's why there's a split in Maine, and that's why there's a split in Nebraska. And so but they set up those rules in advance, and they also set the terms of the election. Now there is a federal law, and the Constitution implies this, where the federal law comes from, which is there's supposed to be one election day. So this has always been a problem with early voting, frankly, but it's now going to be an issue constitutionally because the state legislature gets to pick it's supposed to be one election day. This habit, this early voting, to me, has never really been constitutional in the same sense. They got around it by saying, well, the vote doesn't count until election day. So even if it was sent in weeks or months or in advance, or the person voted in person weeks or months in advance, it really was only one election day. That's clearly not what the Constitution or the federal statute intended, but the courts have turned a blind eye to it for convenience purposes. But it is one of the constitutional questions that the Supreme Court has never really thoroughly explicated the logic of why that can be. Why do we have election days, weeks, and months rather than one election day, which the Constitution anticipates and federal law ordains? But other than those limitations, the constitutional limitations of how they can enforce the mechanism or method by which they choose electors, and the statutory restraint and constitutionally anticipated restraint on what day, whether there's one day or multiple days for an election, other than that, they have broad discretion. Okay. And so they set the terms. And by the way, this also means, in my view, all these state legislatures have also passed rules for determining what the accurate count is. So in some cases, they've delegated things to local election boards in terms of how the election is done. How do we get the ballots? How do we count the ballots? Which ballots count? Which ballots don't? What process do we have to ensure the integrity of that process, to make sure ballots weren't bought, to make sure ballots weren't coerced, to make sure ballots actually reflected the intention of a live qualified voter, to make sure people who are not unqualified to vote because of moving, because of death, because they're not a legal citizen, whatever, because they may have a conviction that currently precludes their participation, because we didn't want jails and prisons voting for obvious reasons. For all of those reasons, they can choose who's qualified to vote. They can't racially discriminate or discriminate on unconstitutional grounds in how they allocate that voting right. But otherwise, they have pretty broad discretion as to who qualifies, and how the ballot is cast, and who enforces it. So they can delegate certain things to the executive branch, to the local governments, to cities, to counties, to towns, to state, as they see fit. In addition, they've included in the state legislative process a means of contesting an election. So it varies by state. Some states you have mandatory recounts within a certain range. Some states it's a permissive recount. Some states you have to pay for the recount. Some states you do not.
So actually, if I can stop you there, a lot of people were asking me by email, DM, is there anything that citizens can do to initiate a complaint or to initiate a recount? So this might be answering that question.
Yes, so it varies. So in some states you have a right to recanvassing. In some states you have a right to a recount. Some states you have a right to a manual recount, which means no computers involved. People are individually hand reviewing each ballot, as ultimately happened in Bush v. Gore. And that's where we got the famous the hanging Chad. But did they really intend to vote, or is that indentation not strong enough? The other problem in Bush v. Gore was there were some counties that were Democratic precincts where they designed a butterfly ballot, where it was pretty clear a bunch of people voted for Pat Buchanan who probably intended to vote for Al Gore.
Yeah, apparently he got several thousand more votes than he would have ever gotten normally, and the ballot was like it was obviously terrible, but it had the candidate and these 3 dots running down like this. So when I don't know why there were 3 dots per candidate, but if you punched one, it would have been for the guy up there and not the person here. Terrible looking ballot, but
they called it a butterfly ballot.
What ended up happening? They obviously did not take those votes away from Buchanan, because there'd be no way of determining who they were intended to go for.
Effectively. Now, there are ways to challenge that, in my view, but that ultimately never got resolved. There are different arguments. The Bush people had said if you finished the recount, Bush would have won. Gore people said that if you included all the election irregularities, that at least voter intention, Gore would have won. And in my view, that still was never fully satisfied. I understand why the Supreme Court stopped it, because of the sort of lackadaisical, inconsistent standards. But that's where my view was. The courts are supposed to be an intermediary, not the final stop. The final stop is supposed to be Congress. So, but in many of these cases, the state legislature has chosen to delegate that process about recounts, recanvassing to the executive branch, and it depends on each individual state who can trigger it. In some states, an individual elector can request it, and they call it elector. And what I mean by that, you'll see that language. It means voter. So in some states, an individual voter can. In some states, only a candidate can. In some states, it has to be within a certain margin. Also, it depends on what is, is it a manual recount, or is it just redoing the computer system all over again? Checking whether there are software errors, which somehow all turned to favor Biden this election.
We're going to get to that. The Dominion voting machines, which I'll say one thing. I see some comments saying that the stick is coming down for us in terms of this video apparently was already demonetized, and it came with a warning that said Associated Press has already declared the election. For anybody watching at YouTube, this is a nonpartisan issue. The example I put up on Twitter in my pinned comment now was I'm going to mix it up, a House race where it was given to a Republican, and they discovered an error which flipped the race to the Democrats. And I say, this is not a partisan issue. If there are any glitches, everybody should be wanting to look into them, because it can swing one way or the other, and it can have meaningful impact one way or the other. So this is not about Biden versus Trump. This is about an election process and making sure that there's no glitches that result in Trump's votes going to Biden, as was the case apparently with some, but just not enough to affect the election. So this is nonpartisan. This is determining if there have been mistakes, if there have been glitches, and in a race as close as this, the race cannot be determined by those glitches. But okay, so this, if a short answer, if any citizen wants to initiate something or file a complaint or do whatever they think they want to do, the productive thing for them to do would be what?
So it's going to depend on the law of the state where they're at. So in some states, they can be involved in requesting recounts or recanvassing. Is it a manual recount? Is it a computer recount? Recanvassing can involve reobservation of how the ballots were looked at in the first place, how the ballots were counted. In my view, some of the procedures for what I call the chain of custody of the ballots should also be looked at and examined as part of that process. Inherently, usually in most states, the Secretary of State in most states governs elections. And I think one unfortunate situation is that A lot of secretaries of state try to find ways not to end up in the middle, like that Secretary of State famously did in the Florida case, end up being the target of a lot of harassment and criticism. My view is there's a process here for a reason, and we should use the process that creates the highest degree of confidence. And what does not create the highest degree of confidence is quick concessions. What does not create the highest degree of confidence is media declarations. And the media's idea that, oh, we'll just declare it, and as long as no everybody concedes, nobody can question it. That isn't what happened in Bush v. Gore. After Gore conceded, all it did was leave a third to half of the country believing the election was stolen. So if we care about the constitutional democracy and its integrity and the confidence of the public in it, then we need to go through the constitutionally ordained process to assure the accuracy. And this accuracy has included adversarial processes that are allowed at multiple stages. So the additional way that citizens can act is in many states, citizens can file an election contest. Now, it depends on the individual state, but almost all states have some mechanism or method. And if they don't, there's a way to file a civil rights suit, which I'll get to next, to contest the election. You say that and it depends on the state, but usually the standard is systemic irregularity that is so pervasive that it makes it impossible to know how many ballots were impacted by it. Part one. Part two, individual aggregate irregularities or illegalities that, whether by third parties or state actors, that led to enough ballots not being correctly counted, either being undercounted or overcounted, as the case may be, that reach the margin of victory. That second standard they've inconsistently applied. In 2019 in North Carolina, there was documented instances of absentee voter fraud and illicit ballot harvesting. Democrats demanded that there be a revote, and the Election Commission in North Carolina granted that request. So I favored that, said so publicly at the time, even though it meant a reversal of a Republican. I believe that it was critical and essential to establish confidence in elections. And it's interesting that Democrats now have a completely opposite position now that it's their candidate who won, which I think never favors them. I argued that to Republicans in 2019 in North Carolina, who were pointing out, hey, this fraud margin, that the number of fraudulent votes is way below the margin of victory. And so we've been told the threshold of materiality for the purposes of a new election has always been that the amount of illegal votes must exceed the margin of victory. Well, that isn't the standard that they apply to North Carolina or the Democrats demanded be applied and ultimately successfully. My view is if there is sufficient evidence, it brings an election into doubt, what happened and what transpired. And if you simply have enough examples of dead people voting or other illicit votes being counted or other irregularities, then my view is that the remedy is a revote. I still favor that remedy. Almost no one's talking about it. Most people are talking about throwing out ballots or including ballots. Let democracy fix itself. Let voters vote in an election, but with a more secure, open, transparent election process than what we've just had.
But if they were ever to do a revote, first of all, Bill, thank you very much for the super chats, and I'm bringing them up. The question was, if you do a revote, what do you do about absentee ballots, overseas ballots, military ballots, those types of things, if you're going to have a revote, which would not allow for enough time to get those votes in?
Oh, you still can, just like they're going to do the runoff in Georgia. So they're going to do a runoff in Georgia for 2 Senate seats. We've had runoffs all across the country in different states, Georgia and Louisiana especially. Explain
to a bum like me who doesn't know what a runoff is necessarily, and to someone else who may not know, what is it? How does a runoff work?
So a runoff is if in some states they say that you cannot get elected to Congress, governor, or the Senate position. I don't think they've ever applied it to the presidency. If you don't achieve more 50% plus one of the vote, a majority, outright majority of the vote, not just a plurality of the vote. So in Georgia, one senator is clearly ahead of the other. One Senate candidate is clearly ahead of the other. However, he did not, it appears he fell just short of the 50% plus one threshold. And so he has to do a runoff, a second election between him and the top 2 challengers, because that guarantees that one will get at least a majority of the vote. There's been controversies about runoffs for some time, but They've been constitutionally upheld by the courts. And so if we can do runoffs, why can't we do revotes? In the case of Georgia, for example, the runoff's already scheduled. So we're already going to have a second election. Now we need to make sure it's a little more secure and a little more transparent than this one appears to have been. And there are ways, and we can get into that later. What are some of the reforms and what are some of the procedures to secure an open, free, transparent election in the future? There are plenty of technologies available to make this easy and simple, including things simply as barcodes on the outsides of ballots that are sent in. And then you have a digital tracking of everything concerning that ballot from the time it leaves the election office, goes to the voter, and returns to the election office. When it was scanned in, how it was scanned in. You're not subject to mysterious votes disappearing, votes arriving in a surprising way, and so forth. Ultimately, I believe it won't be easy to do for this election cycle, but I believe blockchain technology is another means by which this could be incorporated in other mechanisms. But that, for example, would at least help protect the chain of custody of these ballots, which is now in question and in controversy in some of the states. But so you can go through the whole election contest process, and the states there have delegated to the judiciary a role. The courts can allow discovery. The courts can, they're supposed to do it expedited, but they can allow discovery, allow evidence to be presented, allow expert testimony to be presented, allow a record to be preserved. Appellate remedies exist. So all of that is there. And many of those allow just for ordinary citizens. Sometimes it requires a certain number of citizens, but allows ordinary citizens to do so. To give an example, just in Georgia after the 2018 elections, many Democrats using electors. A candidate wasn't part of it. Well, it was actually a libertarian candidate who was part of it, was part of the process of bringing legal action in order to set aside the election. It was a case that went all the way up to the Georgia Supreme Court. So there's lots of mechanisms and methods to do so. And by the way, Stacey Abrams brought different challenges, and we just had in 2016, Jill Stein brought challenges all across the country on behalf of effectively, really, Hillary Clinton's campaign. And that's where a lot of the money came from. But there was massive litigation all across the country that only suddenly stopped when they realized that Trump's ballots would increase. And by the way, that's relevant for this election. Back in Michigan, 2016, when they were doing recounts, Trump was substantially improving in his net of vote had they gone through with it. So that's pertinent to what may happen here. So that's, and my view is that goes all the way up through the court process. You can challenge whether the state legislative rules were followed in the way ballots were counted by filing suit in state or federal court. And there the courts can get involved there too. And there you have a right under the 14th Amendment as an individual citizen to file suit under Section 1983 of Title 42 of the United States Code under the Civil Rights Laws, which is interpreting the laws and such, whether or not the election was done in a way that diluted your vote, either by permitting vote fraud to occur or by some other mechanism by which your vote didn't accurately and adequately get counted. Because it was either diminished and diluted by the effect of illicit votes being counted, or for some reason your vote may not have counted correctly or accurately. And so you have that judicial process, and then on top of that, the state legislatures ultimately, join together to certify the electors to go to the Electoral College. They at that point can they're constitutionally authorized to take certain remedial actions if they believe the election did not produce the outcome that maybe the Secretary of State or the local election board said it did. Then you can take it a step further, and so they can send in certify a different set of electors to Congress. In 1876, you had competing groups of electors submitted to Congress. Some in 4 different states. There were 2 different groups of electors submitted as the winner. So it was a controversy that Congress had to resolve, which gets us to the final stage. The constitutional final arbiter is supposed to be Congress. And the way that works is right now Congress passed a law back in the 1870s after the 1876 sort of compromise where that was the second time that the person who won was denied the presidency. 1824 being the other time when Andrew Jackson won and was denied the presidency. Some people would say 1960 and 2000 added to that. Those are still controversial, of course, though it's most likely that John Kennedy stole the election in 1960, and it's up in the air. It's a 50-50 call as to whether W really won Florida in 2000. But in those two, 1824, 1876, the historical evidence is not in controversy. Andrew Jackson won. It was stolen from him. 1876, Tilden won. They did a compromise deal that Tilden was satisfied with because he was a figurehead, not the party picked him. He didn't pick the party. But they passed a law that says, here's the process we're going to abide by in a contested election. My view is that law is even Lawfare, which is a leftist organization, has written a 3-part series on this that people can look up. Understanding it comes from a leftist perspective. They were excusing everything related to Spygate for the last 4 years, and Russiagate for the last 4 years. And one of their main authors has been advocating bribing a Republican senator to get control of the United States Senate by giving them some cushy gig somewhere. So that gives you an idea where their mindset is about law and Constitution. However, even they admit that this process, that the law that's established by Congress can't govern and control Congress's actions, because you can't have a prior Congress controlling what a newly elected Congress is constitutionally delegated and authorized to do. So in my view, they can set up their own rules and determine their own procedures. It's technically the vice president who reads the certification into the records. I guarantee you, if the roles were reversed, Democrats would interpret that vice presidential authority as much broader and is giving him discretion as to whether he himself could contest the outcome. And that's the existing vice president, not the newly elected one. And so there's that potential threshold of challenge, the vice president himself doing it. I don't think Pence would, but he theoretically could. The next question is then the House and the Senate. Right now, the process is a senator and a congressman join together to object to any particular set of electors from any individual state. And if there is a senator and a House member who both object, then they have to subsequently vote on that objection. And my view is that's the process to object to a certification. And then I think the way the Constitution was intended to go is if there was any doubt as to who won, it goes to just the House of Representatives, but not by majority of the House. It goes again because we have a state-driven constitutional process for electing the presidency and for all of our offices at some level, particularly the Senate. It goes to the state delegations, and each state delegation has a vote. And in that context, now it happens to be Democrats don't like that idea because currently Republicans will likely have, when all the votes are counted, a majority of delegations. But that's the constitutional authority. And for everybody out there, this will show you whether these Congress members are serious about election integrity. What it is they want to convince Trump to concede so that they can hide from any irregularities with the election. They don't want to have to take a vote on this issue.
Well, but that's there's two problems here. It doesn't seem, just from a political perspective, it doesn't seem that Trump has the support of even the establishment Republicans on the one hand. But this is the other problem of the media calling the election and creating the expectation in the minds of 74 million people, give or take, that there's been a decision already. You can never plausibly have this, even if it were conceivable, this the lawfare type political solution to a disputed election in a month from now, where the media has already created the expectation that it's a done deal. You would never find any politicians who are going to have the courage to even take that position in the first place, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the current. That was why I believe that Gore should have gone to Congress, even knowing he was going to lose it. It was simply to establish that this is the proper precedent, because this is what our Constitution ordained. Said this is who should decide ultimately presidential elections that have any degree of contested issues about them. Because again, the Constitution didn't say you, the American public. I just skipped one step. The Electoral College gets to have its own vote. And some states don't allow you to be a, quote, faithless elector. It says whatever we told you, the whichever candidate you're aligned with, you have to vote for that candidate if you were the one we, the state legislature, certified as being elected as part of the slate of electors from our state to represent that candidate. Now, there were multiple faithless electors in 2016. That's because many states do not prohibit faithless electors. So it's not consistent across the board that all states have so. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed after 2016 the power of a state to limit itself. And again, this all comes back to the idea that the Constitution gives the state legislature almost non-reviewable authority as to who is the elector from your state to go to the Electoral College. Now, in theory, there's no question that when there's a reason why we have an Electoral College. If we only wanted the state legislatures to be the final arbiter of who voted, of who they are, where their votes are going to go for the presidency, there would be no Electoral College. They did impose the Electoral College to be a check on the process. Now, they intended it probably as an elite establishment check in case someone like a Trump won. It didn't work out that way for them, but there was a great effort made by many liberal legal scholars who said the Electoral College had an independent authority back in 2016. Now all these people are suddenly saying, oh, no, you have to concede right away, and it's a challenge to democracy. That isn't what they said 4 years ago. I want all the people on the left just to be held to the same standards they were doing 4 years ago.
Well, I mean, forget that. Just go to 3 months ago. You have Hillary telling Joe Biden to never concede, and now all of a sudden the reflex is to concede when 3 of the 6 toss-up states are within a 0.5% margin of difference. It's a tough. This is the tough thing, and I say, like, viewing it from an outsider's perspective, where you have people playing by 2 sets of rules, but it goes both ways depending on the context. But in this particular context, it's so in your face where it's learn how to let's unite people. You have Pete Buttigieg on Twitter today saying unite, where I had to pull up a sound clip from Pete not more than 2 months ago saying basically anybody who supports Donald Trump is at best turning an eye to racism, at best, as if to suggest worse. But then you have people who've been demonizing 70 million people for the last 4 years by virtue of their association. You have politicians calling for a list to, expunge the enablers, so to speak. And now you have them talking about unification, which is really, I can see that as rubbing somebody the wrong way. Then you have them saying concede, when 3 months ago you had a former presidential candidate telling Biden to never concede. And so it's sucking and blowing in the most in-your-face way. But suffice to say, I don't think Donald Trump is conceding. I don't necessarily think he should burn the house down to make a point. He should certainly avail himself to the same avenues that were lauded back in 2000 for the candidate who went straight to the Supreme Court and litigated a legitimate concern over the process.
And in my view, he should go all the way through the constitutional process, even if ultimately his goal or objective is to instruct the Republican delegations to concede and to vote Biden if he comes to the conclusion that that's the appropriate conclusion after there's been a full independent inquiry. It'll still take you through that process because the country should get familiar with this is how we decide the elections, that the proper protocol, and that makes your House vote during a presidential election matter even more because it means that it becomes a check on any kind of irregularity in the election process. So if you elect Republicans to go represent your state or Democrats to represent your state, you're doing so knowing that if you have questions or doubts about the election, that's who's going to decide it. And then they're up for re-election just 2 years later. So they can be held accountable at the polls. So that's the way I think that's our constitutional process. And I've never understood why so many of our establishment legal and political types are scared to use the process our Constitution says to use. And they find every excuse to weasel out of it and every excuse not to exercise their duties and obligations in a country that it's losing more and more of its populace in believing in elections. I mean, we were already at a place in the 90s where we were getting less to the point where less than half the country was going to vote for the presidency of the United States. We will return to that and revert to that if we go through an election process that large portions of the country do not have confidence in, do not have faith in. Also, in my view, that by law, by the Constitution, it can never be a stolen election if the constitutional process was used. Then your objection is, golly gee, I guess we should have elected more members to the House on our side of the aisle, or we should have persuaded more congressmen to vote for our candidate regardless of their party. That's a political remedy, and that's why the Constitution recognized this is a political problem about confidence in the election. So we're going to choose elected officials to be the final arbiter of it. Elected officials starting with the state legislature and then finishing with the members of the House of Representatives by state. This was a beautiful system we created, and I don't understand why so many in the press and the political class are scared of using our constitutional system. And hiding behind just saying concession and declaration is going to, if the media hasn't figured that out yet, they have no credibility. And with the people who don't believe, if I was Joe Biden, I would want this process to be fully vetted so that my election, if I were to win, would be fully verified and validated. I would not want to have the perception be that I stole an election when I already have 100 other problems politically. So he's already coming in as probably one of the weakest presidents ever in terms of certain degrees of his perception of his competency and questions of corruption that surround him. You want to add to that by being tagged and tattooed the guy who stole an election, who was scared of an honest vote, who was scared of the constitutionally designed process. I wouldn't if I were him. The only people who are afraid of this process are people that are afraid the process will disclose and divulge serious irregularities with the system that bring the election into doubt. So their very aggressivity in trying to foreclose this process proves there's more than just smoke. There's fire.
Okay, so one question actually someone had just asked. It's a variation of a question I had asked you in DM. Hypothetically, something comes up that utterly discredits or makes it impossible for Joe Biden to become the president. What happens? Does it go to Kamala Harris as though she was the candidate, or does Trump win by default, so to speak?
I mean, it still is whoever Congress ultimately certifies as the president is the president, who they really select. Now they pretend they're not selecting because they're just certifying the vote that was certified by the state legislatures, but it's whoever they pick. Now, and so so if something happened between now and then, they could pick someone else, obviously. So that could always be an option. But traditionally, what happens is if for some reason there's incapacity, or death or anything else, or resignation, that the vice presidential nominee then becomes the president. Okay. Now, the House would pick the president in the case of a contested election, or in the case, and they have the ultimate authority, period. The House would pick the president, and the Senate would pick the vice president. But it's by state delegation in the House.
Yeah, that was one question. The other question a lot of people were asking, and it was a couple of super chats, are you going to file an amicus in any of these proceedings? Is there a possibility that you might crowdsource or do something to get involved in these proceedings? Or is there a possibility you might get involved with the Trump team by some fluke?
Yeah, I can't comment on any conversations I've had with any member of the Trump team. What I'll say is I have publicly stated that I will assist in any way I can, and have recommended different procedures. If ultimately for some reason that ends up being outside the normal process, I've already talked to people about trying to create independent fundraising to put together a team of lawyers to bring challenges wherever we can. Because my view is, independent of the outcome of this election, we need to have we need to start to enforce our constitutional process so that we can restore faith and confidence in elections. And like I said, if it goes to the House and that's how it goes, you can't complain about any of it, because that's how the Constitution ordained it. You can complain about how you failed to elect the people you wanted to elect to the House. But other than that, my view is that's a political remedy, an electoral office remedy, for which you have remedy at the ballot box 2 years later. I want all parts of this process to be utilized. The second part is to use this case, independent of the outcome of the election, to whoever wins. I've expressed my view that I believe an honest election would produce Donald Trump as the president. But I may be mistaken, and that's for evidence to develop and see what can be proven. But at a minimum, we should go through the process to vet it, to get as much confidence in the outcome as we can, and to reform it. Find out where the problems are. Where are there chain of custody issues with ballots? Where are there issues with how people check and verify signatures on absentee ballots? Did no excuse absentee balloting lead to more question? Did it do what Jimmy Carter in a bipartisan commission under Barack Obama concluded, which was that absentee ballots were the highest risk of fraud? We just did the biggest absentee ballot election in history, and we allowed people to do it with what they call no excuse absentee balloting, and removed almost all the guardrails and safeguards to prevent fraud. Well, what did that produce? Did it produce more fraud? That tells us how we have to govern our elections in the future. Are there issues with these machines? I mean, it's extraordinary. We started this entire election process in Iowa with a suppressed poll, with misinterpreted poll information, by the Seltzer poll being suppressed about the Iowa caucuses, and by what else? Manipulative software, amazingly named Shadow, and now this is named Dominion. I mean, where did they come up with these names? It's like right in your face.
And in fairness about Dominion, I was looking it up before. It's Canadian company. It has been a donor. I know, based in Toronto, not Quebec.
Yeah.
It's a Canadian company. It's had issues before. It has connections to certain politicians. This is on Wikipedia. I mean, this is not what's the word I'm looking for? This is not controversial stuff. This is just they were contributors or donors to the Clinton Foundation. They might be just as connected to certain Republican politicians as Democrats, but they have connections. They have software parts coming out of China. They've had glitches. They've been known to have glitches, and apparently there are known glitches this time around. This is the first question I guess everybody's asking. I made a undumb tweet on Twitter, which was, this is an ever-moving target now. It starts off as there's no fraud, which I'm saying fraud is the wrong word to be using here. We should just use irregularities or glitches, because fraud implies a sort of a conspiratorial intent. But are there glitches? There are no glitches. Okay, there are glitches, but insignificant. Okay, well, there may be some glitches, but they're not enough to change the results. And then now, there may be some glitches, but they've been remedied because we found them, and we found that there was evidence from the Dominion glitch. It took 6,000 Trump votes and gave them to Biden. They found the glitch and they resolved it. And that's somehow supposed to then say, okay, well, we got that one. No, there's nothing else to look at here, which seems problematic. As of what we know now, because people are asking, what is the prima facie evidence of any form of irregularity? And what is the threshold in order to take this prima facie irregularities and make something of it?
So there's really sort of a bifurcated process. Now, what I've always used, and we talked about, people can go back and watch the prior live streams. We talked about this before the election. So this isn't some post hoc, rationalization or anything else.
Let me cut you off there. Actually, if anybody wants to go back and find that segment where Robert, I think it was in a highlight, went through it step by step as to what the risk was and what we're witnessing now. I don't want to say it was cosmic. Maybe it was an easy prediction to make. If it goes down, this is the way it goes down, but it certainly has proven timely. So sorry, if anybody can find that, flip me the link.
Yeah, exactly. And because we went through it, and what it is first you look for, the reason why I look for statistical evidence is because then you know whether there's a problem or probably isn't a problem in the inception, in the get-go. It's not necessarily, it doesn't guarantee fraud occurred. It doesn't guarantee that fraud did not occur, but it's strong indicia of it. And so you have things like, I'm gonna make sure I get the name right, Benford's law. It's something that certified fraud examiners use all the time. And then all you do is give them a data set, and they use Benford's law to see whether there's anomalies that are not likely to be produced organically and authentically. A bunch of people have been applying Benford's law, including certified fraud examiners. Those are people who take specialized tests and specialized education to be able to identify what fraud is. And they have a certification called CFE, Certified Fraud Examiner. And one of the most common methods they use is Benford's law. And a bunch of people have used it and said the election results as reported at the time and date they were reported violate Benford's law and suggest fraud is a more likely explanation than anything organic and authentic. The second thing people have done is they've done detailed review. Like they said, let's test a hypothesis. If we'll test all the reasons given for the timing of certain vote shifts. And instead, and we'll test those against the available data versus say, what if the motivation was to make sure they got just enough votes to offset the Republican? Which better predicted how the vote data would come out? And they applied this in Milwaukee, and the conclusion they came to is the best predictor of the data was how many votes Democrats needed to overcome Republicans in different areas, not the other explanations given. Again, it's not a guarantee, but it is prima facie evidence that something took place. And to give folks an idea, in prior election challenges brought by Democrats, they alleged that an election should be set aside merely because there was an undervote. That goes to the third issue here, which is there is unusual overvoting in the presidential election. So typically when people vote, they don't just vote for the top office. There's a few people who will, but not a big number. And what's amazing is, especially in the swing states, there appear to be hundreds of thousands of votes that only cast ballots for Joe Biden.
Okay, and now people understand that, and I'll give you the pushback because I know what my response to that would be. The argument here is that that people it's an anomaly that people only went in and checked off the one box for Biden without checking off the senators or the other people on the list. It makes no sense. Why would they do it? Some people are going to say some people just don't care. They hated Trump so much that that's the only office that they cared about. And it was, whatever, they got the youth out to vote, and that's how they did it. They didn't even know who the other ones were. They just wanted to vote against Trump by voting for Biden. That's going to be the argument.
Yeah, and there's two issues with it there. And this also sort of fits within, you have the first prima facie evidence, then you have the counter, whatever the counter is, and then it's kind of like racial discrimination laws. Then you get to rebut the presumption. But it suffices for prima facie evidence out of the gate. But as to that question, we have two analogous historical comparisons. This is the way Democrats presented evidence as grounds for a new vote in recent election contests that they have filed. They said that merely the existence of overvoting was sufficient to establish a prima facie case. So we're just using their arguments and their standard as to the prima facie component. Second, they compared it to past elections within a state. But here we have another advantage. We can compare this to rebut that argument. Look at other states. So there are other states that were not tightly contested on the presidential level, but had Senate races, had House races, some even had governor's races. Do we see the same drop-off? Do we see a uniquely high percentage of people who just didn't care about voting for anything but Joe Biden for president? The answer is no, we don't. How is it Alabama, everybody can vote up and down ballot, but somehow in Georgia they can't? So given it's historically anomalous within that state compared to past elections, but it's also anomalous compared to other states in this election. So and it happened repeatedly. It appears to have happened in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania didn't have the Senate race, but it does appear to have happened in the House races. It appears to have happened in the Senate races in Michigan. It appears it may have happened in the House races in Wisconsin. So you see this unusual pattern of people only voting for Biden and no one else. And again, that the Democrats have argued that statistic by itself is sufficient to show systemic irregularity that could warrant a revote or other electoral remedy. Now, the comparison I make is a fourth level comparison, and there was some confusion out there. There were people on the locals board who did some great research to produce, produce counter evidence to say, okay, here's this hypothesis. Does this hypothesis find support? And they pointed out that in multiple swing states versus other states, there was often similar increase in total votes. What my comparison was going into the election was certain specific areas of what I call low propensity voters. And that is, do you see for example, urban African-American big city precincts where Republicans are concerned about potential vote fraud because of the Democratic control over those cities and because of a history of people being indicted for vote fraud in those cities, including just recently last year, an election judge in Philadelphia indicted and confessed to committing lots of election vote fraud by what means stuffing the ballot box. So I compared, at least so far, like cities to like cities. Look at Cleveland in Ohio, which was less contested, not a democratically controlled state. Look at Chicago, which is still democratically controlled, but because it's not as contested, what happened? Was this organic interest in Biden that produced the unusual turnout, or unexpected at least turnout in Milwaukee, Philadelphia, and Detroit and Atlanta? And so you compare places like St. Louis, compare places like Chicago, compare places like Cleveland, compare places like Newark. And people can go back, by the way. I was saying to compare these exact cities over a month ago, that this would be the analysis to use. And here's the thing, and at least from what I've seen to date, Newark, St. Louis, Cleveland, and Chicago had below average turnout, depressed turnout, down turnout, and yet somehow Milwaukee, Philadelphia, and Detroit had major spikes in turnout. Now, that could have been the product of unique organization in those states. That's a possible explanation. But what's not not a realistic explanation is organic, authentic interest. And then the question is, was this a product of real, just effective organization, or was it the result of some problematic behavior? But we are seeing the anomalies that fraud analysts use to look at an election occur across the board. I mean, we're seeing it in terms of the timing of ballots being counted, in terms of waiting for Republican. People have asked why did I talk about waiting for Republican ballots to come in first? It's because the reason why that increases the risk of election fraud occurring is that you know exactly how many ballots you need. And so it's like, okay, and it's amazing. How is it that Republican counties can count all their ballots quickly, but Democratic counties always take forever?
No, and actually, let me ask you one question there, because people ask questions on Twitter and they're so obvious that I don't have a clue. Why is it that they can count millions of ballots within the first 24 hours, and then it takes 2 days to count the remaining tens of thousands? I mean, I'm not asking it in a conspiratorial or accusatory way. I just want to understand it. Are they using a different system after the day of? Is this the day of? People go in and punch it into a machine, and afterwards people are like manually pulling them out of envelopes? Is that one of the explanations?
I haven't heard the explanation. And all I can say is if you go back and read about the 1946 Texas Senate race, this is how fraud occurs, that you keep finding ballots until you make sure you find enough of them. And that at least is a more historically correct explanation for this peculiar delay in vote counting than is any explanation I've heard so far from any of the election officials. So again, maybe there's an innocent explanation, but that's why our electoral contest process should go forward. Let this go through the adversarial process. The state or the Democrats or the county officials can put on their best evidence, can rebut the other evidence, can cross-examine evidence that accuses them, establish a record that vindicates your position. That's what I would want to do if I was on that side of the aisle. And I've been through this in multiple contexts. So I've been a campaign manager of a campaign victimized by fraud, couldn't find the means to prove it, but all the people I identified as fraud got on the radar screen, and within 2 years, almost all of them were convicted of other crimes that they were involved in. And that's the other reason. I mean, let's vet our process. Well, what election officials do we have that are good or bad? What supervisory processes do we have that are good or bad? I mean, Florida, the governor did a great job. He knew there were 2 counties that had a history of problems, that had a recent history of major problems. He put independent supervisors, and guess what happens in this election? No problems in Florida. And Florida had mass mail-in balloting. So how is it Florida can have no problems, and states that disproportionately trended Biden have all these problems?
Actually,
it looks bad.
Let me stop you there. Stephen Carpenter makes a good point. He says many colleges are online, therefore all those kids are voting at home, not in cities. That alone should change the vote total in Philly.
Yeah, in many places. And the question is what happened in some of those places, and whether the other thing is, in most states, ballot harvesting is illegal. So the question is, that's where we need to find out the chain of custody of the ballots. Was that broken? Did the ballot go directly to the person who was an actual voter? Is that the voter who filled it out? Is that the voter who sent it back? Or was there ballot harvesting? What I find very unusual is that in particular in the swing states, there were a bunch of ballots that apparently didn't come in until election day itself, and weren't apparent, and some of them appear not to have been reported until early in the morning the next day as even coming in.
So honestly, that smacks of ballot harvesting. So does it mean it occurred? I'm just saying, but it is circumstantial evidence. As lawyers, 9 times out of 10, we're dealing with inferential evidence and circumstantial evidence. You never find the guy with the knife over the body saying, "Yep, I did it." You always find circumstantial evidence. So I hear these media types saying, "Oh, you don't have direct evidence." You don't have direct evidence of anything. I mean, 9 times out of 10, you can't get direct evidence.
This is the problem where, and not to call it an intellectually dishonest discussion, but it's the moving target discussion where, okay, so you have different types of evidence that you would use. You have you're going with the statistical Benford's law. Then they'll say, okay, well, that's statistical. You didn't see anything, so that's all hypothesis. And then when you get into the actual, there are reports of actual glitches. You say, okay, well, that's not enough to change the results. That was found out and resolved. Then you have issues of apparently, and I would love confirmation about this. You don't know what you can believe anymore online, but apparently confirmation that 10,000 people who were dead voted in Michigan.
Well, I mean, Richard Barris did and that's People's Pundit. People can look him up either on Twitter or on his YouTube channel, People's Pundit, or they can go to People's Pundit Daily. I think, in fact, he's going to try to start aggregating all of the data and documents and analysis that he can find concerning issues about potential election fraud to filter out the good evidence and the weak evidence and put out the best evidence on both sides wherever you can find it. He was by far the most accurate pollster. He, by the way, has been predicting this for 3 months. He has said none of these states are even prepared for what's about to happen. It's going to be a disaster. It's going to be chaotic. And it's going to make half the country believe, no matter who won, that the election was the product, that they were not, in fact, elected to the presidency. And that's a major problem in a country like the United States.
With our platform, we can see what people are saying in other countries. And, our base might be a little more not biased, but they might be of the other side that thinks this is not looking good. But people in other countries, Ireland, the UK, very far away, saying this looks like a joke. It looks like a joke, and it smells like a joke. And even if it's legit, it looks like it's not legit, and nobody's going to take this seriously. And people are sort of laughing in a very bad way. Not that the democracies are any better in other countries, but this is the United States of America, and this is what it looks like. And people abroad don't take it seriously, except for the ones who want to jump to the declaration already.
And if these outcomes were in other countries, we would be saying that the election was the product of fraud. So if these kind of irregularities happen in an election that put Putin into Russia in power, the American press would all be calling it fraud. So we need to apply the same standards to ourselves that we apply to the rest of the world. In fact, we should be the exemplar, not be the example that's wrong. So going to Michigan, Richard Barris painstakingly spent tons of time and money out of his own pocket to go through. He has extensive voter files, so he can go through and cross-checked it against all of the voters from the Michigan election officials. And he found at least 10,000 people recorded as voting in Michigan who his data file shows beyond doubt were dead before they sent their ballot in. And so and that's a painstaking analysis, by the way. If it's just in one state, just one search produces 10,000 plus people dead voting, that's a major problem in an election.
Yeah, but where do you go with that? Do you take that information, take it to the politicians? Do you take it to the police? And what's that information worth when nobody? Let's take for granted it's true. I mean, it may be false. Maybe there's 10,000 people with the same names who voted. There might be an explanation. Let's just operate on the basis that it's true. If nobody's looking at it, what do you do with it?
So, in my view, there's 3 different places it matters. One is the court of public opinion, which, as I said when we talked about this on Wednesday, is critical. It's critical to continue to do it. Now, that's why the press is in a mass censorship campaign. That's why big tech is in a mass suppression campaign. They don't want people to be aware of these issues. The problem with this, ask anybody that lives in Cuba. The net effect of state censorship and suppression is that people don't believe anything you say. Cubans believe crazy things about their own government that frankly aren't true, and think America is like a pure paradise.
in ways that are exaggerated, because they so distrust anything their own government ever says, because that's always the product of censorship and suppression. All you do is create an effect that people are going to believe the opposite of what you're claiming. So this big tech censorship campaign, this big tech suppression campaign, this big media censorship and suppression campaign is undermining democracy. The only person fighting for democracy right now are those people, is President Trump and those around him, because they want an honest vote and a vote that people can have confidence in. And unfortunately, everyone else doesn't want that. And they don't want there to be any inquiry, any investigation. They don't want the constitutional process to be utilized. They don't want the independent adversarial process meant to check the accuracy and truth of information to be verified. And it's deeply problematic. And what they don't understand is, in the name of defeating Trump, they are killing democracy, and they're killing the credibility and the confidence in that democracy that is essential for any democratic society to function at a basic level. And I think it's an egregious error on their part. And it's, again, back in 2000, I was for Gore going through with the House, even though it wouldn't produce the outcome he wanted, because it was the right way to go about it. It was the constitutional way to go about it. And that's what we should do here. Go through the entire election recounting and recanvassing process, then go through the election contest process. Then the state legislatures can have their role in whether or not to certify the election or not. Then Congress can decide whether to object or not. Then Congress can vote. And that's what should happen. And if Republicans conclude that Joe Biden is the elected president, they're going to vote that way. If they conclude that that's not the case, then they'll vote that way, and they will be held accountable at the polls 2 years later. And so that's what our Constitution ordained. It was not to have election by media. It was not to have election by CNN.
This is the main thing. Like, if I have a preference in this, and it was that I thought Trump was going to get elected, and the reason why I thought it was important is what we're seeing right now from Peppermint. I tried to post an article on Benford's law and got suspended from Twitter. It's not an accident that now that big tech has seen that they've been emboldened to censor, that they're going to do it rampantly. And if Trump is out of office and he's no longer president and cannot be censored on Twitter, they're going to do it to anybody and anything who posts anything that they deem to be violating whatever the terms of service are at that time. And that's the barrier that I see, Trump as being, and we're seeing it. That barrier has been breached, and when that barrier is gone, it's going to be Twitter is going to turn into an echo chamber that everyone's going to leave. They're going to maybe go to Parler. What are the other ones? Maybe go to Rumble. They're going to go elsewhere, but you're going to end up with these polarized echo chambers that is going to be absolutely divisive and destructive for any sort of cohesive society. That was my rant. It's unbelievable the level to which Twitter has now started censoring, banning, giving warnings on countless Trump tweets, without any consistency on any other tweet that may be just as inaccurate or just as hyperbolic or just as exaggerating. And we're going to see more of it. And that's what I find to be the worst thing in this. But that's what I was going to say about that. And that's all I have to say about that. Forrest Gump, first movie reference. Richard Barris. Okay, so Richard Barris does this research. He'll say that it is undeniable. 10,000 plus deceased voters who cast a ballot before being deceased. That should be enough to get the ball rolling under the normal run of things. But CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, even, they're not jumping on this to look into it. Do we say everybody should tweet that result or message that result to any news outlet that might have a look at it? The Post Millennial, Newsmax, anything else? OANN?
I think all of those. But in addition, it's reaching out to your state legislator, your House member, and your senator, and to those across the country, because we need to have elections that people can have confidence in, and if they want the public to trust them again, they need to go through the constitutional process and the adversarial process that our laws are intended to follow and are intended to utilize to resolve these matters. They're very effective procedures to resolve and adjudicate these matters. We have plenty of time. It's a couple of months before Inauguration Day. So the idea that we have to rush this is nonsense. And rushing it will only cause more problems. I mean, for people that are critical, for example, of 9/11 conspiracy theorists, Kennedy assassination conspiracy theorists, etc., It was the effort to suppress information that led to those conspiracy theories. So if you don't believe those conspiracy theories are true and you believe they're bad for the country, quit suppressing information and use the constitutional process. Quit censoring people and allow there to be a free and full debate and discussion. Use the adversarial process as it is intended. Use the constitutional process as it was designed, and we can have a country that at least, maybe everybody doesn't, but a lot more people can have confidence in the outcome of the process. And that would give whomever is elected a lot more power than if they don't have that confidence.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see what we got from Richard Barris, pollster analysis of the People's Pundit Daily. Joe Biden underperformed Hillary Clinton in every major metropolitan area around the country, save Milwaukee, Detroit, Atlanta, and Philadelphia. Well, there's good. So, and now I was listening to Scott Adams today because he was, I'm not cynical or skeptical, but when he says it's 60-40 likelihood that Trump is the president in January, I may not be. So I may not share those statistical predictions. But he was saying how the internet now has all of the smartest people in the world who were able to find that actor. Just do it. What's his name? Oh, it has a B in it. Don't let your dreams be dreams. Just do it. Okay, someone's going to say it. Who put that flag up in the middle of nowhere, and the internet found the flag based on a mountain and cross patterns of airplanes. So if they can do that, they can they'll make an argument here. I just think that the problem is the media. It's the media censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop, which they sort of apologized for, but a month later, and now they're suppressing all this, and they might apologize for it a month later, and by that time, the damage of the non-investigative, the non-open journalism is done, or the damage. Maybe the objective is obtained. Okay, hold on. There was a couple of super chats that I wanted to specifically get to. Okay, this one's off topic, but while I have it. Mr. Barnes, Colorado passed Proposition 113 stating that Colorado electors will go to the U.S. majority vote. I read that as well. It was something on the ballot in Colorado. So now apparently their state is going to give their electoral college to whichever candidate gets the general popular vote.
Usually most of those rules, they said that would only be enforced if a majority of electoral college votes agreed to do so. But maybe Colorado didn't have that limitation. I haven't looked at it in further detail, but they clearly have that authority. Because again, it's up to each state legislature how they decide to allocate their electors.
Okay, this is amazing. Fox News suspended Jenny Pirro last night. She was supposed to be talking about things like this. Yeah, Fox News. Fox News. I was just surprised by the coverage, but just because you expect the pushback to CNN and not the pulling in tandem with. Okay, then we have Josiah B. says, in applying a statistical test like Benford's law, Allegheny, Connecticut, for example, as suspicious case, sufficient for a court to allow additional examination. So this is going to be the question now. You get in front of a court. Actually, this is going to be the perfect segue to the next subject or the next category, the state of the lawsuits before the courts. The lawsuits that had been filed that were dismissed, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and I think there were two others. I only got to read the Michigan one, and I took for granted that the other lawsuits were filed on the same basis. For anybody who doesn't know, Michigan, they filed the lawsuit, and it was basically asking for supervision. No, this was in Pennsylvania and Michigan, asking for supervision of the ballot counting as it was going on. The lawsuit was ultimately dismissed because it became moot. They had already counted, so there's no issue anymore. Was that the case with all of the lawsuits that have been dismissed? And are there substantive lawsuits on the actual allegations of fraud that have been filed, or are we expecting those tomorrow?
You may get them at different times. So you have some that have already been filed on behalf of voters in Arizona on the Sharpie Gate issue. In terms of that aspect, I believe some have been filed in multiple jurisdictions on a range of topics and issues. But ultimately, the way the election recount process usually works is that first you go through a recount, then you have a recanvassing. Then if there's still problems, once they do a certification, that's usually when you can challenge it in state or federal court, depending on usually state court, but there's you can use a certain method to get into federal court by adding a civil rights claim and argue pendent jurisdiction. The federal courts don't like to hear these though. So that's the caveat to all of this, and nor do state courts. But you can raise all of those issues. So like for me, for example, the three areas that stand out is I have questions about whether the signatures were verified on a range of these mail-in ballots. I have issues about how the whole chain of custody worked with these ballots. Why did they arrive when they arrived? Why did they seem to be counted in batches that Benford's law and other statistical analysis says what an honest and authentic production would not produce? Why were they far more? I mean, to give other examples, the Biden people put out on election day what percentage Trump needed to win key states by, and the reason why the betting markets moved on election night was because Trump exceeded that. It's the reason why Trump's team thought they had won. They exceeded what Biden's campaign themselves said. If Trump wins by this margin or bigger in the election day vote, then he wins. He went and did that. And what happened was that's why you had people on CNN, people at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, a wide range of Democratic-leaning election commentators say late election night, early morning election night, that Biden could not make up the ground in Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania or Georgia. And yet somehow all four came through. So these massive batches of votes that came in, the question is, what was the chain of custody of these ballots? Did some of these states not have barcodes attached to both? You should have a barcode attached to the what you mailed the ballot in, and the same barcode be attached to that ballot so you can track and trace. In other words, so if you find out, hey, this signature wasn't valid, it wasn't received timely, or there's some other issue with it, you could account for it. The other reason to have barcodes is, let's say you're in a Republican jurisdiction, you scan it in yourself so you can track it, make sure it didn't disappear somewhere. And if we don't have basic barcode technology on our election ballots, then we have serious problems. One side point. There's a theory out there that's a QAnon type theory that this is all a secret sting and Trump orchestrated it. I can guarantee you that's not true. So the idea that Trump wanted this to happen is just, it's the problem with the QAnon all the way through, which was trust the plan, and it lulled people into a false sense of self-confidence, so they weren't paying attention, so they weren't prepared, so they weren't taking protective action. So they said, don't complain about Julian Assange being in prison. It's a secret strategy to bring him here. No, it wasn't. He's rotting in prison, and scandals that could have been exposed didn't get exposed because of what happened. So that theory is nonsense. Not only that, they don't even know how ballots are actually produced, who prints them, how they're printed. There is no federal standard that governs this. It doesn't come out of the Department of Human Services or anywhere else like some people are claiming. That's all nonsense. I'm curious about the whole chain of custody. But the third issue is observers. In many states, it's required law that they have observers there when they get the ballot, when they check definitely when they're counting the ballot, sometimes how they check the ballot in. And some states, for example, require that when you get the ballot, you have to personally review the signature, check it against the voter file, make sure it matches, and then you have to initial when that ballot came in, how that ballot came in, time and day, and initial that you, the election official, validated that signature. I can tell you this, in the petition circulator context, the same state officials routinely disqualify 20% or more of ballots. In both New Jersey and New York, that happened this last election cycle when there was mass mail-in balloting. Somehow our verification rates are skyrocketing. So I want to see that. So the safeguards that could trigger legal review are ballot chain of custody issues, verification of signature issues in terms of the mail-in balloting. The third is I just blanked on it. I'm sorry. Oh, the observer issue. There is additional issues can you show that someone that was not qualified to vote voted? And that can be because they're dead. That can be because they moved. That can be because they're not a citizen. All of those are relevant and pertinent. And what you do is you take the statistical evidence plus to show materiality, to show, look, the amount of irregularities from statistical every day people get convicted and go to prison based on certified fraud examiners whose only evidence the government has is indirect inferential evidence from statistical anomaly studies. So, that's why they're called certified fraud examiners. Their main role in life is to testify in court. So they're qualified as experts all the time. I hope the Trump team is putting together a team of certified fraud examiners to be ready and prepared to challenge these in court in an election contest. And then why it matters is, don't just think about the court you're appealing to. Think about the court of public opinion. Think about Congress, all of its influence together to make sure that this is not about whether or not, because let's say we go through all the evidence and come to the conclusion, you know what, they just had a fantastic get out the vote operation in swing states. Okay, God bless. Then at least all of us can have confidence that, okay, we went through the constitutional process. We used the genius of the adversarial process to create confidence in whomever was elected president.
It was like Cleopatra's last super chat. Same comment is, you may be upset with the results. You just want to feel that they were fair. And a lot of people saying, well, it's not just because it's a close result that there's fraud. Exactly. Well, first of all, that's nobody's position anyhow. It's sort of the straw manning, but it's when it is a close result that if it is a close result that is in fact determined by irregularities, it needs to be known. And if there are none, that at the very least, people just need to feel comfortable with that close result. Right now, with the statistical anomalies, even if the numbers are not determinate, if people find out that 10,000 people, dead people, have voted and the ballots received, because just so nobody makes this mistake in arguing with other people, voting rolls are different than received ballots. So the fact that you have 20 some odd thousand deceased people on voter registration rolls, I forget what they're called, doesn't mean anything. It means that they're not kept up to date. Where it becomes an irregularity is if any of them cast a ballot that is received. So nobody like forwards, oh look, there was an article going around. That doesn't prove anything. Receiving ballots from deceased individuals who died before the ballot was sent, that shows something. 10,000.
It shows two things. For people out there think, oh, well, it's only that 10,000. No. How did 10,000 dead people vote? Should we assume that the 10,000 dead votes represent the full scope of the number of false ballots that went in? Because if they sent 10,000 ballots in on behalf of dead people, why couldn't they have also sent in 100,000 ballots on behalf of people who may be alive and actually qualified to vote, but who just didn't send in that ballot? Remember, folks, they have access to the voter files, so they knew who voted and who didn't. I mean, this is why I'm bothered by the timing, right? So it's one thing to if these would have all come in say September or October, early October, but when apparently hundreds of thousands of them only showed up on election day. Well, if you're going to commit fraud, we go back and reverse engineer it. What you would want to know is who had and who had not voted. And you would and you just simply have a lot of ballots that you mark in being in their name, and you just fill them out. This is old school voter fraud, is that the precinct person does it, but you wouldn't need an election official's complicity at all. A third party, you could have third party fraud influencing the process. And frankly, that's what this election invited by scrapping all of these safeguards. And that's the other reason to go through with this litigation. No matter the outcome, let's establish what happens when we do an election like this, because if this amount of, this is, by the way, why the Democrats and the press don't want an investigation. They don't want people to come to doubt this method of election because they would love to use it in the future. And this is where Republican institutional establishment people that are keeping their mouths shut should be second guessing what they're doing. Because does anyone think they're going to stop at Trump? If you believe that they committed fraud, or you believe this method of voting creates illicit methods of voting and voting fraud, they're not going to stop now. I mean, especially if they have great confidence they really won, their only reason to be scared of a challenge is worrying not that the election would be reversed, but rather that this method of voting creates such problems in the court of public opinion, the court of law, and Congress that it is never repeated again. And I believe that has to be, I believe that's likely going to be a remedy. And any election process that can produce more than 10,000 dead people voting is a bad election process.
It does, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter what the population is. It doesn't matter what the difference was. It's the fact that it can happen. And if 10,000 is not widespread enough, even if it's 0.1% of a population or of a state population, that's enough in my mind.
Not only that, it signals they weren't just sending it in for dead people. The idea that they stopped at dead people, 10,000 is a sign of a much bigger problem. It's like if you had discovered in just one bank account, the secretary had embezzled $10,000 and you knew that she had access to 100 other accounts. Would you say, golly gee, I'm sure she didn't embezzle any other cash? No, I know the government, by golly, wouldn't conclude that.
Problem solved. We identified it, we got it, and she's fired, and there's nothing more to look at. Tom, this was a question that I actually almost forgot to ask, and thank you, Tom. Justice Alito ordered twice mail-in ballots received after Election Day in Pennsylvania must be kept separate. The Pennsylvania Attorney General is apparently ignoring this order. What can the SCOTUS do? First question first. Thank you, Tom, for the super chat. Thank you for the reminder on the question. What is the order about? I posted it to Twitter. I underlined the section which said Alito said this was in defiance or had modified an October 28 order, and I didn't know what that meant. Did Alito order the separation of any ballots arriving after whatever it was 8 o'clock election day, and were those ballots counted? And what order were they violating? Do you know?
So, I mean, the whole Pennsylvania litigation, for those who may not know the background of it, is the state legislature required that the only ballots that could count were those ballots that were received by the election officials prior to the closing of the polls, which is 8 p.m. on election night in Pennsylvania. However, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decided that they, not the Pennsylvania legislature, got to make the rules, even though that's exactly what the Constitution does not allow for or authorize. It doesn't say state courts determine electors. It says state legislatures do. So the Republicans appealed that to the U.S. Supreme Court and asked for emergency injunctive relief to prevent that from occurring. The first time it was a 4-4 split after Ginsburg had passed away. The second time, so there was and what happens with a 4-4 split is the underlying state Supreme Court ruling is effectively affirmed. Then when Barrett was put on the bench, they went back up, and Barrett chose not to vote on the issue, so they couldn't change the 4-4 tie. However, the Pennsylvania Attorney General, and people can look up the kind of comments he's been making on Twitter and ask yourself whether you have confidence in his not impartial enforcement of the election laws in Pennsylvania. Note the distinction, by the way. While Republicans are terrified, all these Republican elected officials, secretaries of state, attorney generals, governors in states where there's controversy, they're terrified of anybody saying anything bad about them in the press. The Democratic attorney generals are saying, screw you, we're going to make sure you lose. This is why Republicans lose. You can't go into you don't go into a gunfight, folks, carrying a knife, unless you're going to get real close. So but that's unfortunately the way a lot of these folks are. But in order to satiate the Supreme Court's concern, the Pennsylvania Attorney General promised back on October 28th, don't worry, you don't even need to get further involved in this because all of our state officials will segregate any ballot that comes in after 8 p.m. and make sure it's not counted until this issue might be resolved post-election. Then it goes back up to the Supreme Court, and it determines he cannot produce affidavits and declarations from election officials clarifying that they, in fact, ever did that. And that's why Alito got upset. And then in Pennsylvania, here's my other problem. If you didn't do anything wrong, you don't do it in the middle of the night. If you didn't do anything wrong, you don't count the votes last. If you didn't do anything wrong, you don't kick out observers. If you didn't do anything wrong, you don't lie to observers. And if you didn't do anything wrong, you don't refuse to obey court orders, as both the state of Pennsylvania did in response to the Supreme Court, their own promise to the Supreme Court. And you had the sheriff of Philadelphia refuse to enforce an order for to observe the election count right there in Philadelphia.
Yeah, and
why are they hiding and lying if there's nothing to hide and lie about?
And for anybody who hadn't seen that video, the Court of Appeal, a judge from the Court of Appeal said, bring in the observers. We recognize they've been denied. The lower court confirmed that they were not allowed to get within a certain distance. So they were allowed in the room, just not within any useful observing distance. Goes to the Court of Appeal. The judge says, no, give them within distance of 6 feet. They'll use the masks or whatever. It was confirmed. It's confirmed that they were being denied adequate observing powers. The votes that were supposed to be segregated that were apparently not segregated, they've been counted, correct? I'm not wrong in concluding they've been counted, or we don't know?
We don't know. We don't know. It appears they never followed the process. And again, no observation allowed that to occur. So the fact that, I mean, the reason why we have independent observers, and my view is independent observers should be there throughout. I think what should happen is when the ballots come in, the ballots don't get you scan it in as having arrived, you put the date and time, and then otherwise you don't open it until election night after the polls have closed. Then you open those up in the presence of observers to make sure the signature match occurred correctly, and to make sure the ballot counting is taking place correctly. I mean, you have videos where people appear to be marking things that could be ballots. You have Project Veritas showing people destroying things that appear that may be ballots.
No, and apparently Project Veritas' latest expose, they've got a signed affidavit from, I believe it's a UPS delivery. USPS, it was a mail person who attested to the fact that he was. I'm going to maybe do a breakdown tomorrow because it'd be a good short analysis of how to read an affidavit, but there's a lot of hearsay in the affidavit, as in what this guy saw other people do and say. But there's enough first-hand information in there as well. But apparently confirming that he was told to predate ballots that had come in after 8 o'clock on the 3rd. It's worth what it's worth.
And you have Milwaukee. You have the police escorting a bunch of ballots over. What was that about? Did they sit on those ballots at the post office? So there's a range of issues that are problematic. That's where I'm about the chain of custody. In other words, again, they'd already removed most of the safeguards. Didn't require a person to ask for a ballot to be sent to them in writing. Didn't require the person to have a legal excuse to request it in the first place. Didn't require a person to witness or notarize it. Some of the states, like Wisconsin, don't even have signature verification requirements. Some of these states, there had been a question asked, I think, on the locals board, which people can find at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. And we use that as a sort of control mechanism and as a backup mechanism in case the censorship or suppression comes. During it, that'll be an interesting occasion.
Just so everybody knows, we're 1 hour 41 into this. I have never had a strike on YouTube that stuck. There was an error one that they removed. I have never had any tarnish on my untarnished reputation on YouTube. I expect that to be respected by YouTube, but you never know. This video has been apparently it comes with a warning now. So apparently we're doing something dirty, Robert, by actually.
What I don't understand is, do they not realize? Look, the warning only makes the Democrat, the people who are on that side of the aisle happy. It does not deter, or all it does is sow distrust. I mean, I remember arguing with friends of mine who are on the left about Cuba and saying, look, this suppression backfires. People in Cuba believe things that they think America's paradise. They think that if they go to America, they're going to live in big homes. Now, I'm not saying there's a lot of legitimate criticism of Cuba, to be clear. But my point is that they believe things that really aren't true because their government suppresses information and censors so much. It's like all it does is lead to sowing deep distrust. I used to argue, like, people who don't like Alex Jones. I said, you know where Alex Jones came from? Alex Jones rises as the media's credibility falls. And the idiots in the media have said, oh, that must be because Jones is causing the media to not have. No. It's people lose credibility in the media, and then they seek out and find Alex Jones, and they discover he tells them more truths than the media does. So if you don't like Alex Jones, start telling the truth. If you don't like Alex Jones, stop suppressing and censoring information.
It was Brian Stetler the other day says it's going to be so nice to go back to having a world in which the media is not under attack with Donald Trump out of office. And it's like, the media, your credibility is not coming back when Trump leaves. Well, I'm just going to be more skeptical of what you're reporting on Joe Biden. But and Trump didn't do that to you. You did that to yourselves. But they either understand and they pretend not to, or they just don't because they lack.
They really don't. They don't understand cause and effect, and they live in such small echo chambers. I mean, that's where they've convinced themselves that the proper way to resolve an election issue is to hide and suppress and censor information, despite the fact that never leads to more confidence. So it's very unfortunate, and it's very disturbing, frankly. And that's where willing to deal with it. In terms of the remedy to Daniel B's question about the 600,000 late ballots in Pennsylvania, if they were counted, what to do about it? There's two different remedies. One is to not count any ballots that were counted after a certain time, or sort of discard them or throw them out. The other remedy, in my view, still is that there should be one of two remedies here. That Congress gets to certify the election and decide for themselves who they really believe won, based on all available evidence and information developed by that time presented to them. And or secondly, we have a revote, like we're going to have a runoff in Georgia. We have a revote in those states where the election outcome is contested. We do this all the time. We just did it a year ago at the request of Democrats in North Carolina in 2019, and that was good, by the way. I mean, Republican ended up winning it. I mean, maybe maybe Biden wins. So it's not a do-over. It's that when we didn't have an honest election outcome that people can have confidence in, a remedy is a revote. Now, I personally prefer the House vote, but if the House, doesn't want to take responsibility and it's constitutionally delegated, authorized accountability, then it could be up to the states. But the judge could refuse to allow a certification of those electors, and so there's simply no certification of those electors that goes up. That's kind of what happened in 1876. They essentially threw out the contested electors and then made their own choices.
And so that would mean that neither of the parties gets to the 270 because of some of the electors have been not recognized or not certified. Right. That would be. I mean, it's the thing is, someone asked me how I thought this was going to end, and I said I don't think we have enough information to know how it's going to end. Something's going to happen that has not yet happened that's going to cause this to end a certain way, and we don't even know it yet because you can pick the likely outcome that it fizzles out, Trump concedes, massive upset in a month from now.
What they don't understand is, let's say tomorrow Trump is like, screw this. I've taken 4 years of crap. They tried to bankrupt me. They tried to put my kids in prison. I'm just going to go play golf. I did what I could for the country. I don't have to put myself up on a cross. I can understand if he made that decision. I don't think it's in his instincts or inclination. I mean, he's the only president, in my view, this is my own political perspective, that kept his word to working class people since Andrew Jackson, frankly. And so I would fight for him just for that reason. He stood by the people in the place where I grew up, so I would return the favor reciprocally, and maybe doing so soon. But I hope it ends in what the Constitution called for. So the book behind me, kind of pointing to it.
There we go.
It's called Unruly. You probably can't see the title, folks. It's called Unruly Americans. And it's about the two revolutions that took place. And it's mostly about the second. The first revolution we all know about in 1776. The second was when there was an attempt by a group of people within America to create a constitution that did not have these protections built into it. They rebelled. Ordinary working class people all across the country, the people who really were the foot soldiers of the revolution, people like one of my great-great-great-grandfathers, Colonel Prescott, who famously said, "Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes," which maybe Democrats used in this case in terms of when they time their ballots. But it's a great book because it's about the power of ordinary people to make change. We created a constitutional system, so let's have it go ultimately to Congress. Let's use all of the intermediary procedures that have been set up. The state legislatures should have a role. The election contest proceedings should have a role. Secretaries of state should be more concerned with confidence in the outcome than protecting the CYA of their offices. So you're going to see a lot of secretaries of state, regardless of party, want to not talk about software problems because they were the ones who cut the deals with those vendors. But you have to ask, how did those vendors get those deals? How does one software vendor in particular end up in so many key states?
Dominion is, I think they said is involved in 40% of the votes in the United States, the vote counting in the U.S. It doesn't
Why is that? How did that come about? Do we all think that was the product of how they make a law? The little law guy walking up the steps, that they just somehow magically won all these contracts. We need more transparency. I mean, there's people that believe crazy things because they've been lied to about truthful things, and so that's what leads to people going down rabbit trails that are often not constructive. It's because somebody lied to them at some point. And we need honesty and transparency. How do our election? People are often shocked to find out that there isn't a verified paper trail of ballots in many states still. Why in the world is that at this point? Why is that when we have blockchain technology, why don't we have a secondary backup mechanism of utilizing that technology to help secure ballot access and ballot transparency? Why don't we have chain of custody with ballots at least equal to what we do for evidence? Why don't we have means and mechanisms for the laws to be enforced, and if they're not enforced, for harsh remedies to be imposed? So, I mean, my view is an example of a systemic irregularity that brings an election into doubt to me, is removing observers. When you remove observers, you have no idea exactly how many ballots were counted, what happened with those ballots, which way they went. That to me is a systemic irregularity that disqualifies any certification of any electors. And then the question is only remedy. The constitutional remedy is to go to the House. The alternative is a revote in those states. I recommend the second just because I think it would restore the greatest degree of confidence potentially that the public would have in the election. That if we had a much more transparent election where everybody obeyed the rules and so forth, that could happen. But I'm completely satisfied with it being the Congress and the House because that's what our forefathers foreordained. And don't let them avoid and escape responsibility and accountability. Every Republican senator out there, there'll be House members, I have no doubt, that will raise the objection. The question is whether any of these Republican senator would-be presidents, Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, Rand Paul, others like that, just enforce the Constitution. That's all anybody's asking for. They're not saying you have to vote for Trump or for Biden. Just allow the constitutional process to go forward so people can have confidence in the outcome.
Okay, now, first thing, actually, I'm going to bring up this super chat. Yes, I talked about Scott Adams earlier, just briefly. I have to finish listening to it just to hear how it all ends. First thing first, actually, 17,000 people. If I ask everyone to go hit the like button, is it actually going to go up to 17,000 likes? That's one. I keep bringing up the comments that say, hit the thumbs up. Do it and see what happens. I'd love to see 17,000 thumbs up. That would be awesome. Second thing, this is my question, and this is my concern, actually. Justin Levin says, assuming Biden is the next, this is Justin Levin, a super chat from the earlier stages of the stream. Assuming Biden is the next president, what do you think happens with Flynn, Assange, and many others? So first things first, we've talked about it. Flynn probably gets pardoned before this is over with any reasonable prediction. Assange and Snowden, arguable. What happens to Trump after this? Like, hypothetically, let's just say it turns out that he's no longer president as of January. I get the feeling that might not be enough. It's not enough to defeat. You have to destroy, erase, and absolutely crush. What could a vengeful House or what could a vengeful government do to Trump as a citizen after he leaves and all of his entourage, like Giuliani, people who may no longer be in office? Can they go after them personally?
Well, clearly the state of New York and the Southern District of New York have hinted at that. So, I hope not. Democrats are the ones that found it horrifying when people said lock her up about Hillary Clinton. Let's see if what they do when the roles are reversed. We already have people talking about purge list. Basically, that's what AOC was talking about. That's what one of Pete Buttigieg's aides was talking about. My own view is I'm not yet as concerned as many of my friends on the right are about whether or not this gets way out of hand in the sense of the statism, the totalitarian instinct they see lurking in the new left. Now Kamala Harris, that would be a greater concern, but there's some big scandals about Kamala Harris yet to be broken. So let's see what happens with that.
There's no for anybody who has a personal, who's supporting Trump and has a personal concern for his, professional livelihood, his personal livelihood after he leaves office. Is there, not to make anybody nervous, is there a real risk that there could be some serious vengeful reprisals?
Oh, yes, no doubt about that.
And against his children as well, their businesses.
You have high power people who want that. You have people who have a very the way to look at, this is what's embarrassing. We're starting to look like a Latin American government. Like a tin cup dictatorship. So but look at, Evo Morales. I know people on the right don't like him. I still think what happened there was highly questionable. I think he did win that election. I think that was a military coup. Best evidence for it. They had a real vote, and that the Morales' party won even more votes than they had won before. But Morales had to flee. So for his life. So now the place to study there is study populist. So generally speaking, when they throw populists face unique challenges. It's one of the reasons when I was on What Are the Odds with Richard Barris, I laid out why I thought there was a 25% chance, at least, that I was wrong about Trump winning. And most of that 25% was because he was a populist outsider who had kept his word to working class voters. Historically in America, those voters face unique level. Those officials and candidates face unique levels of intense opposition. That's why I'd recommended books like Huey Long by T. Harry Williams, Uncle Earl by A.J. Liebling, books about what is it called? Muleheads, I think is the title, about Big Jim Folsom of Alabama, Rascal King about Jimmy Curley from Boston. I haven't yet written the book about my hometown, Bookie Turner, but he faced extraordinary opposition. And not only does the professional class unite in voting against that person, they weaponize all of their power. And part of that power is to try to criminally prosecute them afterwards, to send a message to any other would-be populist. I mean, ask yourselves, why is Trump so unique? You clearly had massive public demand, public appetite for his set of ideas. The same with Bernie Sanders on the left. You had a large appetite for it. Now, what happened is Bernie, they just screwed over twice, and he just took it and laid down. Trump did not. Why aren't there more of them? Because they're usually made an example of afterwards, and so that's the concern. If they're smart, they wouldn't wage full-scale war on Trump. It's the reason why Trump really stayed away from Obama, because going after Obama would have been more problem than it would have been worth from a political perspective.
Some people are just going to say that, the people, two sides are playing by two different sets of rules, and they might. I mean, there's a number of other people saying, Trump's got 70 million loyal followers. There's a number of things he can do, even outside of the office. But
in fact, if there's if this election goes to Biden by hook or by crook, so in other words, by legitimate means or illegitimate means, my own view is that Trump should organize and better institutionalize his movement, and establish a Trump TV, either by One American News Network or Newsmax or both maybe, and create an independent network. Kill Fox. If people want to watch what's happening at Fox, watch the HBO show Succession. It's a very thinly disguised story about the Murdoch family. And what they're portraying inside it is that the kids want nothing to do with Fox as it's currently established. Fox, remember, tried to take out Trump initially. And the only reason they backed off, contrary to the nonsense that Gabriel idiot who writes for the New York Magazine prints, Roger Ailes was initially adverse to Trump. What happened was Trump decided he was going to start to sink Fox's brand. Their brand went down 40% in 2 weeks. And that's when they decided maybe we won't be so hostile to Trump for a while. But they clearly did everything. They hired a Democratic data analyst he never should have called Arizona. I mean, whatever ends up happening, that was a ridiculous call. Look at all the states where Trump is way ahead, that they refuse to call when there's not a good basis to believe their vote's going to change, like Alaska.
No, Alaska, it didn't make sense. Not by 20%, even if they've only counted half the votes.
And none of the even liberal data analysts think Alaska, there's any chance goes to Biden. And yet they rushed to call Arizona when it's within a razor's edge. Yeah. It just shows, and people who point Richard Barris, well, again, was one of the people who pointed out ahead of time. He said, folks, here's what's going to happen at Fox on election night. And it's great to see him get a surge of support. He's one of the honest, good, decent people in the world, good family guy. He's a Viva Fry of polling. Good, decent human being who needs more support in an age when we have a lot of corrupt institutional actors who need to be pushed back against. But yes, it's a real risk and they want to elevate that risk as potential leverage in trying to coerce a concession.
Oh no, and I also just say in deterring any other credible, in deterring anyone else from running as an adversary. It's like when there's rules in war, and when you know that your adversary is not playing by the normal rules of war, it could in theory deter people from even engaging, because they know that I don't know who has the skin and the durability to deal with what Trump, love him or hate him, and call him a sociopath in the manner in which he was able to do it, to deal with what he's been dealing with for 5 years. You may think it's a sign of psychosis, narcissism, whatever mental illness you call it as. Not many people can do it. It's
no doubt. But I mean, he is the only. I mean, you could argue Jimmy Carter resisted deep state policies, but the only person to not start a war since Jimmy Carter, or expand a war since Jimmy Carter, And like them, he faced, I mean, look, if he would have just gone along with deep state agenda and whatever you want to call it, dual state, national security apparatus, you can stick whatever language label you want on it that makes you feel comfortable. I use the deep state because it's the most logical explanation of it, and it comes from over 100 years of academic scholastic work. This wasn't a controversial term until Trump used it. But the dual state just aptly describes what happens when you have a dual state that has administrative bureaucratic control, unresponsive to elected officials. But if he simply would have gone along with them, if he, in terms of, escalated conflicts with Russia, gone into Ukraine, gone into Syria, gone into Venezuela, they would have praised him from high heaven. The New York Times would have put him on the front page, and he would have been easily reelected. He chose to stuck with his promises, and this is the consequence he's faced. Personal assaults and attacks at a record level, and an election seriously in doubt. And maybe the most in doubt in American history since Andrew Jackson in 1824 had it stolen from him. But I hope his remedy first is to remember Dylan Thomas, the great Welsh poet, who, seeing his father age near or fade near into potential death, famously wrote, "Do not go gently into that good night, but rage against the dying of the light." And that has been a good mantra to use in many contexts. That there's a simple purity in the act of moral consciousness. It's like my old Quaker history professor who refused to ride the bus. He always rode the bus, refused to drive his car because he believed the automobile posed a problem in terms of the environment and civil society. And so, there he was rushing out to the bus stop every day from 1969 to whenever he retired, I think in 1993 or 4, somewhere around there. And it shows like where, and every year he'd be the sole guy protesting the armed forces parade because he opposed the militarization, the celebratization of militaristic society because of his Quaker roots. To me, just that example, I said, there's something brilliantly, beautifully conscientious in that act that you often don't even know the effect and impact it will have on future people and future societies and future parts of your own society. So that's why you always take the noble, conscientious act, and I hope he does the same. I think other things he can do, if he gets to the point where he thinks the only potential out is a concession, he should force the Congress to pass real meaningful election reform law so this can never happen again. That can include requiring various methods of verifying and validating signatures, verifying and validating the chain of custody of ballots, of preventing and precluding ballot harvesting from occurring, guaranteeing observation with real consequences if such observation does not occur, including individual consequences for elected officials. And I hope he starts his own TV network, builds a real populist movement, and frankly, he'd be a lot stronger. If he gets reelected now, he still has a lot of hindrances and hurdles that a Trump 2024 or someone that's Trumpist in 2024 would not face. What this has exposed is the need for institutionalized support of populism. One of a populist cause and ideas, building networks. One reason why we created the Locals Network was not only to have a backup in case the censors and suppressors come for us, but to also have a place to build a community of convivial conversation free of both trolling and censorship, and to help expand that and deepen that, widen that, and broaden that. And the goal, and we just need to do it. The book I've often put up behind me is called The Populist Moment by Lawrence Goodwin, because it's how a bunch of little farmers and a bunch of little mechanics in 1870s, 1880s decided they were going to take on the biggest railroads and monopolists in the world. And if you want to talk about ridiculously impossible odds, that would be it. It's like Medgar Evers, who I grew up idolizing as a kid, who famously was one guy in northern Mississippi. Why he thought he could take off, 200 years of bad history in Mississippi. There was no logic behind that. There was no reason behind that. When people say, look, all the courts are never going to help. The Congress is never going to help. The court of public opinion is going to be suppressed and censored by the press. So why fight? Well, it's what Medgar Evers said. He said, most men die 1,000 deaths every day. I'm only going to die once. And so I hope that is the way we rally to our constitutional democracy. And the remedy is just to allow the constitutional process to go forward.
Okay, amazing. Now I have to bring one super chat up, not this one, the one that I saw before, which was Brandon Hall. Is there proof of hammer and scorecard being used in this election? I am reading this across the net. I don't know what hammer and scorecard is. I think I read that it had something to do with the CIA operation. Do you know what hammer and scorecard is?
Yes. So the concern is raised by Steve Bannon and Sidney Powell is that it was used to manipulate the vote in substantial part relying because so many of our ballot methods are electronically accessible. Now, I can tell you in most states, they've made them impregnable from hacking by the actual vote counting so that it's a closed network. It's not accessible outside, at least supposed to be. So I'm not sure about that. As my own view is the evidence for that is not, it needs to be better developed and better established. And my view is it's not necessary to go down that path. I can tell you neither the courts nor Congress will pursue that path. And I think it requires more substantiation. So I'm not saying it's not true. I can't say that. I'm not in a position to say that. But I can't verify it or validate it either. And I do know some evidence that would say that at least parts of that are not likely to be provable in court. That doesn't, foreclose it. I would have to research it further. But there's been a lot of great work by data people. I'll give you, for example, the voting machines in Georgia. A Democratic judge just last year said that there were that the voting machines were so poor and problematic, and they had made some efforts to replace some of them, but it doesn't appear all of them were. And given that the other problems that we've seen occur with the software, which is separate from the machines, you've had software problems that magically flipped votes. In those cases, there was an actual observer, an accepted testimony in Georgia that said 7 of the 8 machines changed votes to the Democrat from where the vote was. They witnessed it live, and it was accepted testimony by the court. And so the court concluded that this was an unreliable mechanism and method of doing vote counting. These machines, given issues with these machines. Now, a lot of these issues arose after 2000. There are a lot of allegations of the voting machines manipulating the ballot in Ohio and Florida, but Ohio especially in the 2000 presidential election. And this was my criticism at the time, because that never got fully vetted and tested in court. There's a tendency by courts to say, oh, that's just speculative. I won't allow the testimony in. And I've always said, allow the testimony in, allow it to be cross-examined. And if you want to conclude what you want to conclude as a court, go at it, have at it. But don't do it in such a way that it leads to more skepticism rather than confidence in our election system. So there is some risk of that. We don't know what happened with some of the software. We don't know what some of these machine problems that may exist. I know from the 2019 court record in Georgia that Democratic participants, Democratic lawyers, and Democratic judges said there were major problems with voting machines. So maybe they got remedied. Don't know. But it would partially explain. It is a possible explanation for this weird batches of evidence. I mean, one of the batches of votes. So what the statistical anomaly that many people are pointing out, and some of these people are nonpartisan, they're just curious. They're trying to use their okay, I have this toolbox of statistical skills to be able to check whether fraud occurred and just looking at the numbers. And I'm looking at these batches of votes that came in and they simply don't make sense, or they have badges or indicia of fraud attached to them. That could be the product of machine tampering. That could be the product of something wrong with the machine. That could be the product of software issues. That could be the product of some form of infiltration that was inappropriate or illicit. I mean, if some of these machines, or you're mentioning, that that have Chinese subcomponents, how does that happen? How do we have our elections decided potentially by Chinese technology?
It's not to sound conspiratorial. I mean, it's just there are certain things that are national security issues that should remain national production issues. It's not.
I guarantee you that the Chinese ain't allowing American technology to count any votes they ever cast. Okay,
let's see here. We got David Nachson Albright says, I don't understand how SCOTUS allowed election changes by the state judiciary when by constitutional law it's up to the state legislature, period.
Yeah. I mean, the word is that it was what I predicted with Barrett, that she was untrustworthy, and that happened. We're in this debacle because she chose not to act, in my view. But that ship has sailed. And then I think the scuttlebutt is that Roberts really was hopeful that the election would be decisive, and so that the Supreme Court could avoid ever getting involved.
Yeah,
and that was his position. Now they're going to have to rule one way or the other. But I think they would still like to be in a position to be as uninvolved as possible.
And that's, kind of unfortunate. But that's where my view is: send it to Congress. That's what the Constitution called for. It didn't say let the Supreme Court decide an election.
Yeah, but except people are just going to say Congress is just going to approve Biden, ratify Biden, and legitimize Biden, and that's
okay by me. That's what the Constitution calls for. And if I don't like how they voted, or anybody else doesn't like how they voted, by golly, we can throw them out in 2 years, and we can get different people in there. And then in 4 years, we can require they take certain promises as part of their candidacy. But that's the elected process. And now I would like more direct democracy anyway than representative democracy, but putting that for reasons exactly like this, but putting that issue aside, philosophical objection aside, this is what our Constitution called for. And so that's where it's like, I may complain, but I'm complaining about what our Constitution called for. So I'm really just, I disagree. It's like disagreeing with a policy choice. I'm disagreeing with the choice these congressmen made, but but I have confidence in the outcome because that's what the Constitution said was supposed to happen.
All right, now Owen Jones, last super chat I'm going to read before going to some locals comments because I want to get some of the locals questions in as well. Laid off due to COVID. Anyone know where I can volunteer directly to fight the election fraud? I have nothing but time and determination. Post your comments in and let Owen know what he can do. It's...
Yeah, and I think Richard Barris is trying to organize as much of an effort as he can. He's the most trustworthy, authentic individual out there in terms of data analysis concerning votes that I know of, trying to aggregate in one place the various criticisms and comments. So you can always reach out to him, and obviously reach out to me. And I'll be following what people say on the subscribers. I may not always be on the main page. I'll try to be, but definitely with the subscribers, I'll be checking that out every day, multiple times a day, trying to both respond and get your information to people that need it.
Okay, awesome. And I might be a little less involved in that because I sort of like to think that I'm more of the explainer, and Robert's much more useful than I am when it comes to that anyhow. So I can only offer what I'm good at. Antoinette on Locals says, this is the evidence, although others are disputing this, at Viva Fry, and she posted People's Pundits, some messages from People's Pundits, which were showing the evidence of deceased voters in Michigan, allegedly. I want to get a question here. I'm going to pick one here. Coming from Fuzzy Pickles. If Trump has to activate his plan to get House Republicans to vote for him, IIRC, I don't know what that stands for. It's an IIRC, it's an internet thing. It's based on proportional representation by state. To remain president, do you think that could get him back in office? If not, should he just do it on principle to expose the GOP? Okay, so we've answered that one a couple of times. Jay Rashad said, I suggested on here before that high visibility podcast, like Joe Rogan, would be a good place for you to bypass the mainstream media and inform the public re-election fraud. If this is a possibility for you, how do we make that happen? I'm going to try something on Twitter afterwards. We'll see where it goes, but it's a good idea. Robert, you've never been on Joe Rogan, eh?
Nope.
Okay, people, that might be something to make happen. Let's see what we can do after this. Okay, then we got Real Mike G says, even if fraud is proven in front of the Supreme Court, what are the remedies available and can they be employed given the time constraints? Okay, we've answered that for sure. Additionally, what is the legal hurdle to actually prove fraud occurred and that it had enough material impact to affect results? We got to that one as well. From Mick Hugh, what do we know about Dominion's ties to the Clinton Foundation? That you can Google. I mean, we talked about it. You can Google it. It's on.
You can just. Or you can go to DuckDuckGo, not to undermine Google, but
it'll be on Wikipedia until there's an edit battle on Wikipedia over the accuracy or a typo. And let's get one more here just so we can say hi to people on locals. SISOF Fitz, SISOF Fitz says, thoughts on the irony that if this goes to SCOTUS, Biden and Harris will be arguing Justices Thomas, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. So that's a funny thing. Now, apparently back in Bush v. Gore, who was it? It was Justice Thomas Kavanaugh who were counsel for Bush.
Barrett and Kavanaugh.
Barrett and Kavanaugh. So the world is filled with fun coincidences, but when you get into the Washington world and other milieus, it's a very small, I dare say, incestuous circle of life. And then we got Greg 76 says, in Barnes' opinion, what was the ballot box stuffed or some electronic hijinks used? Heard issue in Georgia, was ballot harvesting true or not? So I think we've covered all of those, and I think we've covered pretty much everything as to where we stand right now. So the lawsuits that are going to be coming tomorrow are going to be more substantive because thus far the lawsuits that were filed were about observation and were not substantive fraud, right? That's my understanding.
Well, there's different timing. So if it's an election contest, that won't necessarily happen tomorrow. That usually happens after they certify. So I think the first step is request for recounts in some states. I think, and they may be moving forward in Nevada because according to the lawsuit in Nevada, it's another example of tens of thousands. They've identified at least 9,000 people who are not qualified to vote in Nevada who are listed as having voted. And so, I mean, the good thing is they have been following the direction that we discussed earlier, well, I guess last week, technically, which was, document cases of materiality, not only in statistical abnormality that is most likely an indicia of fraud, but also establish, if people really think the election, if they have serious doubts about what happened, and I'm talking to Democratic friends of mine who don't like the way this looks. And there's several friends of mine on the left who, while they probably won't join me, I think they were tempted to, because I've been arguing to them for a long time. And for people who don't know, I've represented people across the political spectrum in this precise election context, been doing it since 2002, represented Ralph Nader in one of the most brutal legal wars in election context that went on for 5 years, long after the election, against the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. They were both aligned against me, against Republican state officials, Republican judges, other Democratic appointees. I mean, it was something to behold. And then at the end, they just wanted to make sure I didn't get paid any legal fees after I won. So it's a case that's described in Ballotpedia as a landmark case. So, and there was a lot of times, folks, when that case looked dead. And the reason why I took it and fought it for as long as I did was because even if it did make an impact on that election, it was going to make an impact on future elections. And it protected and preserved the ability for people to circulate petitions, for people to get on ballots, for independent third-party people to run. It got rid of certain problematic contest procedures. It made dramatic improvements that improved the ability of our political process to be more free, more open, and more transparent. And the goal will be to achieve the same objective here, so that to rage against the dying of the light, because the mere act of doing so may bring some light.
Amazing. And with that, Patrick Henry, if it goes to Congress, president-elect, wouldn't the vote be by state delegations? Yeah, I think we talked about that earlier.
Yes, it would.
Robert, I think it's a good time to... So we're going to... if we have to do a midweek stream again, we'll do it to see what the lawsuits come out this week. If anybody gets copies of the actual lawsuits, flip them to me, either at david@vivafry.com or on... I think my open box on DMs on Twitter. I like to wait until I get an actual copy of the lawsuit just so I can walk through it myself and not go on articles summaries, because I'm convinced 99% of the time the media does not actually read any of the lawsuit before reporting on it, which explains a lot of the inaccurate descriptions and coverage. So if anybody has the lawsuits, I'd love them. Only public documents, because I only report on stuff that's public, and I'm not a breaking news story guy. But we'll see. It's going to be a very interesting time to come. My biggest concern, really, and it's probably part of the intent, is that at one point, Robert, you said Trump was playing the judges, which is not a bad tactic in terms of getting prepping them for things that might come their way. I'm certain the media is playing the public and also playing the judges now as well, because they've created an expectation that in 75 million people who are dancing in the streets of New York, that itself creates pressure on the judges, that there's not going to be very many judges who are going to want to do anything that's going to overturn or crush that expectation, because we saw what Chuck Schumer said about the Supreme Court. You see what people talk about the Supreme Court. They put them in a position now where if it gets to them and they're the deciding factor, they're not necessarily going to want to defy the will now, and the glee and the joyful glee of everybody who thinks and has been told Biden has won. So I think they've set the table there. So it really is a question of how strong the evidence is, any evidence, if and when it comes out. And people are going to see what impact that has on their opinion of the system.
Exactly. And my view is to focus more so on the process than necessarily the outcome. Let's make sure we have a process that instills confidence in the vote, and let's make sure we have a process that conforms to the constitutional expectation. And we have failed that test many times before. It is time we utilize and return to it again. So that, and I think that should be the focus of people connected to Trump or anyone else. Let's have, there's no reason, there was a lot of hiding that went on. There was a lot of illicit activities that went on that usually is the sign of questionable behavior. Maybe in the light of day, that will not be the case. But that's why we need an independent investigative inquiry to use our adversarial process, to use the constitutional process so that we can ascertain both truth and at the same time get to the justice that the Constitution compels. And that means go through the constitutional process. And all these people that are afraid of that constitutional process, who want to abscond from it or abandon it, are not serving the country well or the Constitution itself.
Well, you had a 2-year investigation into Russia collusion. Whatever you thought about it, people went along with it. It was an investigation, thorough as anything, an audit of the most important election and the closest razor-thin elections in the history of America. I don't think it's too much to ask for. I think it's a bare necessity. Okay, Robert, everybody, thank you all for tuning in. This was another amazing one. We'll see what comes out. And at some point in time, we will have other non-election stuff to talk about. We still have that O.J. Simpson video to stream to do one day after all this is said and done.
It may not be this week, but probably next week for those who are subscribers on Locals. I'll start doing weekly videos that will have like book reviews and movie reviews and other topics that aren't, reviews of great cases, famous cases, important cases, and through history and historical characters. And so it won't be as heavy as some of our current topics have, unfortunately.
Yeah. No, I think people need a distraction, and I will occasionally be posting. I'll post all of my silly, Viva family stuff in there also, so people can learn how to make the best pumpkin seeds ever for anyone who wants a break. So everybody, thank you very much for tuning in. Robert will say our proper goodbyes, but everyone, thank you for the support. Thanks for everything, and we'll see you this week.